Okay, I'm here. I see you.
So yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm in my I made it back to Wisconsin to my parents' house. I was in LA, and then I was almost gonna be like, yeah, I'll just hunker down with some friends for a couple weeks, and then and then I was like, oh no, I need to leave now. And it was like I was canceling shows and canceling shows and canceling shows, and then everything in the West got canceled, and then my next gig was in Michigan. And so then I was like, well, at this point I might as well go back to my parents. But then I was still being like, well, I lined up some meetings with friends and TV people and stuff while I'm here, so I might as well take them get the most of this.
That's great.
And then once they closed the restaurants last Sunday or Saturday or whatever, I was like, oh, I need to leave right now. I was like, what if they start closing gas stations? Like, I was freaking out.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a freak out kind of situation. Well, I'm glad you made it to your parents. Kinship will get you through this. I do. I see him connecting to audio. Let's see.
Oh. Okay, I think we're good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hi, I'm Shane.
I can see you.
Shane, Carlton, nice to meet you.
Hey, nice to meet you. This is fantastic. I mean, this aspect of this sliver of time that we're in is fantastic. Carlton, I don't know what Deb told you about me, but I've been doing the science podcast, Here We Are, for 5.5 years. I do them all in person, and this is my very first ever remote podcast. I'm a touring stand-up comedian that's passionate about science, and so I usually look up academics and go to like behind the scenes at zoos and stuff like that when I'm on the road to interview folks. And so I thought this would be, now that we're all on lockdown, I thought this would be a really great opportunity to try out remote podcasting and get some guests on that I've had hasn't worked out scheduling wise or geographically in the past. And I think this is I think people are all of a sudden going to be like, wait, I think science might be important to know.
Maybe we should pay attention.
Yeah, maybe we should actually pay attention. So anyway, I don't consider this a comedy show. I just happen to be a comedian that hosts this show. So I go entire episodes with some people that it's very serious subject matter and everything else. So there's no need to be anything other than yourself on this show.
Okay.
But
lucky enough, that's all we know how to do.
Yeah. Well, sometimes when people find out that I'm a comedian, they're like, "Oh no, am I gonna have to be funny this whole time?"
Oh, yeah.
It's not at all the case. And I'm just going to stop recording. Okay. Sorry. And then other than that, I think so normally I record this podcast for an hour, but these are all new. These are just special episodes that I'm doing. So I just really, I love your book, so I think that we'll have plenty to talk about. But I've just started telling guests, like, I don't care if it's like 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, like whatever. I'd rather have it be short and sweet than long and labored and me reaching for things to say. And I'm basically with that I'll just start.
You're really gonna hold up our book?
we can always edit afterwards. And
why are you just this? I mean, if I could have it up behind me, I would too.
It doesn't. There it goes. All right. So let's just start and go. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. This is a very special, interesting episode. My name is Shane Mauss. I am in my former life, I was a traveling stand-up comedian back in that old occupation that used to exist. And, and in my travels, I would often look up scientists to interview for this podcast. I've been doing this for 5.5 years, and they were always only audio, and they were always done on location. And this is the very first ever remote Here We Are podcast, and it's one of my favorite subjects. We're talking today with the authors of the book. I just figured out how to do this fancy background, and it's not perfect, as you can see, but I'm talking with the authors of the book Objection. Oh, is it still coming in? Disgust, Morality, and the Law. I'm talking with Debra Lieberman and Carlton Patrick. I had Deb on. So Deb, I had on the show a couple years ago. Maybe, something like that.
Last year? Since 2018.
Yeah, and I tried to get you on as well, Carlton. You weren't, I think you were out of town at the time when I was in Miami. I read the first 2 chapters of your guys' book, and I'd never done this before. I emailed Deb immediately, and I was like, can we record 2 podcasts? Because I already have so many more questions than we're going to have time to ask. And this is such a fascinating book, and it's strangely relevant to the times that are going on right now. I've been trying to, everyone's hearing everything about Corona on a loop on the news, and I want to show people that there's a whole bunch of different aspects of science and a lot of different takes and angles on every subject. And so I'm really excited to talk with you guys. So thank you for being here. And why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourselves?
Carlton, you first.
Okay, sure. So my name's Carlton Patrick. I'm an assistant professor of legal studies at the University of Central Florida. I worked with Deb in Miami. Deb was my advisor in the PhD program there. And I came to her when I was a practicing attorney, and I said, I have these ideas about why I think evolutionary psychology is valuable for the law, and I'd like to study it, and there isn't really anyone doing this, and would you be game for kind of teaming up and taking me under your wing? And she said, sure, and brought me down there. And so I got a PhD in psychology under her tutelage there, and now I'm in a legal studies department. So I teach law-related courses and that sort of thing, but my expertise is in law and psychology, evolutionary analysis of law type questions.
Amazing. Debra, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Deb Lieberman. I'm an associate professor at the University of Miami in the Department of Psychology. I study a range of topics, including kinship, emotions like disgust, gratitude. I'm interested in close relationships and in general, how the mind works.
Amazing. And you were also, you did stand-up science. We saw each other recently. I was in Florida in, what was that, the beginning of February?
I think end of January, I think it was, right?
End of January, doing stand-up science, and you were one of my 2 academic guests. So I think this is, I guess the best way to get into this is lining up some kind of basic principles of this, of what your book is about. So let's see if I can paraphrase. Much of it is kind of thinking about how we make moral decisions and this stuff, morality, our value judgments on things, what's good, what's bad in life. These have long evolutionary underpinnings that go back long before modern humans, and pre-language, these are built off of mechanisms that, for say disgust or rewards, that that every species has, that that humans with all this fancy language stuff and culture are able to express in ways that that have been kind of co-opted by our disgust systems. Is that a did I just completely butcher everything?
No. I think that's a good way in. You know, our areas of expertise made it such that this book was just a very special project. Having been thinking about disgust for a while, and Carlton being a legal scholar, it was just, I mean, I feel very fortunate that he came to work with me. And I'm sure the other folks who could have written this book are very sad he didn't come work with them. But it's, our particular approach to the book was really trying to outline what is disgust. And we started off thinking about the different functions that disgust evolved to perform. And those are regulating what we eat, who we touch, and who we choose as a mate, as a sexual partner. And throughout the book, we start talking about why those are particular problems that our ancestors would have faced. So to take the first one, eating, you know, what counts as something good to eat? We have a system, our food psychology, that tries to evaluate every piece of everything and judges whether it is something good to put in one's mouth. Does it have sugars and salts and proteins? And what kind of cues does it have that kind of indicate whether it's something good to put in your mouth, like sugar, salts, and proteins? Or does it have cues to toxin presence? Is it possibly poisonous from a plant? Or is it rotten and potentially harboring microorganisms? And so our food psychology puts all of that together and spits out a value. If it's, you know, seems good to eat, it'll make it seem scrumptious. And if it's not good to eat, it causes us to feel disgust and to make sure that we steer clear of it. And then there's contact psychology, which is kind of what we're all talking about these days. It's not necessarily social avoidance that we're really all talking about. It's contact avoidance. But making sure that, so evolution built into our psychology a system to make sure we're not touching things that would have communicated disease. And one of the difficult things today is that you don't necessarily know who has a virus, because they might, that's right, they might not be showing cues to infection, and suddenly now, you know, it looks like they're safe to come into contact with, but no, lo and behold, they're not. But over our evolutionary history, we would have known.
Right. Yeah. So most it's my understanding that basically any sign that maybe something is off in someone, before science discovered things like germs, evolution was just kind of sort of picking up on these cues and developing these avoidant behaviors for even, and not exactly in the most perfect way either, which is like I had my I broke my feet years ago and had a significant limp from a foot injury and stuff for a while, and I saw some research that showed that, you know, if you have some sort of physical defect or anything like that in any way, even a limp, we have a hard time assessing, like, is this a genetic thing that I need to avoid, or is this just a temporary injury? And there's kind of something in our system that's like a better safe than sorry, like, well, I better stay away from this limpy guy. I don't want to catch the limp.
Well, you could also come out of that as a rock star, right? So the idea is like, look, you know, I survived that like 20-foot fall. And so,
right.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you have the ability to have language and explain it to people anyway.
Or lie, yes.
Or lie. So how does this, I mean, as I'm thinking about these times now when just everyone's talking about everything being contagious, and you know, when I had you on in the past, Debra, we were kind of talking about how why do we still mate? So if our ancestors were skittish sometimes about who exactly they're touching and what diseases they might get, you would think that mating would be the most dangerous thing that you could do. We're not even supposed to be touching our faces right now. We're mating. You're touching some very vulnerable body parts together. So what kind of mechanisms had to be built to do that? I know evolution has to have like a lot of different, there's a lot of competing strategies going on in an organism, where sometimes you need to be focused on survival, sometimes you need to be focused on reproduction, sometimes you need to be focused on social bonding or hierarchy. So how did evolution, having built a system to make sure that we aren't eating poison or getting infections from sick people, how did it still allow for us to get down and dirty?
Get down and dirty, great. Well, I'll take this one, but then after this, you have to start asking Carlton about the law.
All right, sounds good.
So it ends up that once you have a system in place that is, so sex obviously is very linked to contagion, and being able to avoid people and avoid getting their diseases has to be suspended. And so you can imagine that a system that was already sensitive to pathogens could now downregulate that in favor of some other types of motivations. And so sexual arousal is a zero-sum motivational system with sexual disgust. So the more aroused you are, the less disgusted you are, sexually disgusted you tend to be. And so given the proper cues that you have a potential mating opportunity in front of you, it could be the case that you have systems that assess the person in terms of, how attractive they are they a good mate, and so forth. And then that downregulates and kind of mutes any type of disgust that would otherwise be present. But that said, you typically, in the course of, sure, you can read about it, but I'll say this anyway. But in the course of, becoming intimate with someone, you typically do behaviors that sample their pathogens initially. It's not typically like all out, like sex immediately. So the whole idea of kissing or touching or getting close to in close proximity serves to start initially sampling pathogens of another individual. And so, and so I don't think we're doing this obviously consciously, but we are in a sense kind of smelling and tasting.
Yeah, you find someone attractive, you get a little closer, take a whiff, and then never mind.
So it goes. And so, but there are ways. So the system, I think, is sensitive to potential pathogens. I actually put perfume on for this video.
I actually don't wear deodorant, and my armpits always smell fantastic.
Musky,
it's
huh?
just, it's a weird superpower of mine.
You shouldn't waste it on online. That's too bad. You have to go virtual.
Well, now that comedians are scrambling for how does a person that made 95% of their income off of live entertainment touring make money? I'm gonna have to start. Maybe I'm gonna have to start getting some swabs of my odors to mail out to lucky fans.
But let me finish. So what I was just
sorry.
Finish my little sentiment was just that, we talked about, so if disgust regulates what we eat and what we touch, it also regulates who we have sex with. And the idea that we have a whole bunch of factors about mate choice and attractiveness and kinship that factor into our system that determine how attractive and sexually viable another person might be. And if they're deemed not to be a good mate, they're a close relative, or they're not very attractive to you, for instance, then we feel a sense of sexual disgust when those motivations kick in. Otherwise, you're given the green, and arousal can certainly lead you to pursue them. But arousal and disgust tend to be opposite ends of a spectrum.
Yeah, one trick you can sort of mentally, or I guess you can go through this in real life to see how these things work along this spectrum is, think about kissing someone you're very attracted to, and you are perfectly fine with that exchange of saliva because you're in a mating opportunity. And so that disgust sort of dial has been turned down. But then one of the examples we think of in the book is then, okay, now picture that same person, and you have your head back and your mouth open like a baby bird, and they just dribble their spit right down into your mouth. The same amount that you would exchange if you were kissing, but when it's not in a mating context, right? All of a sudden, now that's gross, right? Not worth the pathogen risk at that point. But if it's in pursuit of a mating opportunity, okay, we'll turn it down. We'll make the exception here.
I mean, it's insane that I can even, if I were to lean back and spit straight up and then catch it back in my mouth, people would be revolted by that right now. But I'm swallowing my own spit all of the time, all day long.
Well, this is a very academic story for you. When I was in the 4th grade, my friend Casey Floyd and we used to swing on swings every recess, and we would talk about video games and everything else. And then one day, when I was at the apex of my swing and Casey was in the back, I turned my head and I spat, and as he swung with mouth open, my saliva went into his mouth. And that friendship has never been the same since. I don't even know where Casey is today. I mean, 4th grade was a long time ago. But even since that day, just things were never quite right between Casey and I.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty solid move, though. I can see, as a 4th grader, if you land that perfect bullseye like that, I mean, you're a legend on the playground. So, question for both of you before we get into how all of this then leads into how we build and then interpret and use laws. Would you, in terms of that dial, that disgust dial, would you say that if you prime the disgust or contagion or disease avoidance system by, say, putting pandemic updates on the news day in and day out, which you should do and be aware, would you say that would lower sex drive in the average individual if you're just priming disgust more generally? Basically, I'm wondering if now that we're all quarantined, are people going to start having more or less sex, if you had to guess?
It depends who they're quarantined with, I suppose. Why don't you tell us you're hunkered down with mom and dad?
Maybe I'm just...
I don't think this is really going to affect very much by way of sexual desire. I don't. So I think that while we're talking about disgust as it functions in 3 very different ways, some of the variables that feed into our assessment of whether something is good to eat also factor into our assessment of whether something is good to touch. I don't think that many of those variables, feed into, is this a, suitable sexual partner? So kinship, for instance, very much factors into, is this person suitable to touch? But there it says, yeah, this person is worth tending to and touching and making sure they're okay. But in the sexual realm, it's saying, yeah, no, back away, very bad as a mate. And so the idea that these are somewhat separable systems that all share the same motivational output of aversion and avoidance, there might be some carryover, some bleed over, but I don't think it's going to affect arousal as substantially as maybe others think. Carlton, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. Of course, that all goes out the window when my wife starts dry coughing. and showing actual proximate signs of perhaps having the disease. But in general, yeah, I mean, I guess that's an empirical question, and I could guess on it, but my guess would be sort of the same as Deb's.
Well, let's get those surveys out to people and get people doing. What are those things that you guys call the Turkish?
The
M-Turks. I'm not a scientist.
The Turkers.
You should be impressed I was that close. Doing the M-Turks. So Carlton, how do these old evolved systems that dung beetles have, that basically everything on Earth how do these systems then start expressing themselves once you get societies together, once you get cities together, infrastructures in place, you start getting laws in place. How does this influence things like immigration, is this just kind of the extended phenotype of our in and out group behavior? FDA and regulating what we're eating and how healthy it is for it. These pesky public indecency laws that inhibit me from running down the street with my clothes off. How did we decide on these things, and how did evolution shape how culture became the way it is today?
Yeah, so that's the sort of question that I think led Deb and I to write the book. That was our way in. Was, hey, look, when you look around, if you were to work backwards, you look around and we see a lot of laws that seem to be based on this kind of logic. What you're doing is grossing me out. And therefore, I think it's wrong for you to do it. That's and so we sort of wanted to reverse engineer. How did we get there, right? How did we get all the way up to where that has become a satisfactory and notably frequent reasoning for stopping people from doing things. And it wasn't, I mean, I don't think either of us were set out with a mission to say all of these behaviors are okay. It was more to interrogate, well, how did we get here? And then maybe let's take a closer look and see if we're okay with this. Are we okay with this being the reasoning? So the short answer to your question, we in the book we talk about all these different aspects of law where you can spot this phenomenon going on. But I think and each one is special. I mean, it has its own set of context and how did we get here. But there's a common underlying answer here to get, which is that even though laws are these incredibly complicated things that take a high degree of specialization to be able to produce and enforce, and they're part of these very large, very complicated institutions, they're still run and made and maintained by humans. So even if often it's dressed up in legalese, in sort of Baroque procedures, it's still people that are doing this. So these parts of human nature, I think it's kind of a dream world to expect that they're going to be fully absent from an institution that's made by humans.
How is it? There's so many peculiar things that arise from thinking about things in this way, like the idea. It's been a bit since I've read the book. I was actually just listening to it again in January, a bit of it on audiobook. Libro.fm, support your local independent bookstore, by the way. Offer code, here we are. But I remember thinking one of the things that struck me as just like so profound, and I've thought about it quite a bit ever since, is the idea of, now we say like, this politician disgusts me, or something like that, and knowing that disgust is related to knowing what we should and should not eat in a lot of ways. Like, we aren't eating politicians. Well, it hasn't gotten there yet. And so a lot of the ways in which we use language arose from these kind of this fancy language stuff, this cortex that comes up with all these great fanciful ideas we're very proud of, was kind of built on top of the limbic system, and more kind of primitive-ish, quote unquote, framework, that it kind of had to, that scaffolding was already in place, and then our kind of bigger ideas of how we interpret things, and the way in which we language these more subjective realities in these kind of, I don't know, poetic ways, or metaphorical ways is what I'm trying to say.
Can I set Carlton up for some
yeah.
examples? So, so the way that we link from disgust into the law is obviously through morality, and that was an interesting little journey. But we basically made the argument that if disgust is for deciding what to eat, who to touch, and who to sleep with, then how in the world, and it regulates our own personal decisions, how does it get into this third party area where we're using it to care about what other people are doing? And the short story is that disgust ends up giving a bit of a flavor to the value we place on other people when they behave as they do. And so seeing people who might eat things that we find novel and therefore not vetted, and you know, perhaps disgusting to us because we're not used to them, or because we see people having sex with partners that for us we find distasteful personally, or we see people touching things or doing jobs that perhaps bring them into contact with contaminants and so forth. That causes us to value them less. And so disgust ends up being one of the inputs that affects how we socially value other people. And this idea of social value is really important because it ends up that it's used by used by a different universe of mechanisms in our brain that are there really as to manage group conflict and cooperation, if you want to put it nicely. But it's really there to assess who is worth engaging in, who is part of my tribe, who's a cooperator, a traitor, a kinsman, potential mate, and so forth. And we can place value, social value, on all others in our world. And a critical kind of system in our head, by virtue of our evolutionary past, is that males tend to compete for resources that were valuable in terms of land, food, females who are attracted to that land and food, females as well. So the idea that males competed with each other for access to resources, and females tend to choose males based on their access to resources and ability to invest those resources in her and her offspring. And this is true across the whole animal kingdom. Mm-hmm. Because males are in competition for resources, they tend to view other males drawing on resources as potential threats.
I'm actually, as you're saying all this, I'm like looking at Carlton's background, and I'm a little jealous of that light fixture that is above him right now. Very impressive. But
had I known it was going to be this clear, I would have staged the room better. We actually just moved, and I'm cabined into my bedroom because my little ones my wife's trying to keep them occupied in the living room. But you know, had I known it would be this prominent, I would have tried to make you even more jealous.
Yeah. No, I mean, it looks like you got like a nice button-down shirt on and everything. I got this a little cuttlefish on my shirt.
It's a button down with shorts, just so you know. It's Zoom approved.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
All right. But yeah. So men have been competing for resources and potentially mates for some time.
Yeah. Well, I'll wrap this up very quickly, which is just to say men compete for resources. They want to get rid of other groups of men who compete for resources and other mouths that draw on them. And so looking for opportunities to do that, I think, is just sadly part of our human nature. I'm not saying that we can't step around it, but it's certainly part of our human nature. And so what you find is that, so who are you going to try to have not draw on your precious resources? Well, obviously, if you're related to me, I want I want to make sure that you stick around. And if you're a cooperator and you are a trader, I want to make sure you stick around. But everyone else who holds low social value, you're not a mate, you don't trade with me, you possibly hold disease from over there, you eat weird food, I kind of don't need you. And so what you find is that, the world round history, the tale of history is that men have waged war against other, groups of individuals who potentially are threats against these resources. But disgust can fuel this because it is a big old arrow pointing to who holds low social value to me. And so once disgust gets in that mix, either because people are disgusted sexually or by what people touch or what by people eat and so forth, then you can have disgust fuel these moral bonfires to get rid of people, but you don't even have to feel disgusted.
These cockroaches or whatever. Throughout history, there's been all of these disgust-related slangs to talk about outgroups as lesser people.
That's right, but you don't even have to feel disgust. So once disgust has this link, now you can say, earlier Shane used this politician says, Chinese, they're disgusting, or the Chinese virus, or
Yeah.
So I don't know who's saying that, but
no, you might even be able to predict that even today in our modern society, if say you were to put a man in charge, he might fill all of his cabinet with like his close family and friends, and then target out groups by triggering disgust mechanisms and saying, like calling viruses Chinese or referring to like a potential competitor that's female as like a nasty woman or something like that. Just like a hypothetical speculation. You might predict stuff like that might still happen in a modern world.
Yes, I think that it's happened all throughout history. And so, it's unfortunate, but there it goes. And you don't even have to feel disgust. Disgust basically says, here's a group of people I don't value. How about you? Do you value them? And, the idea of starting the charge and putting out a call for other people who might feel similarly is a way to coordinate a group of people to start targeting their efforts against a particular individual or group. And so disgust has a very nefarious link to morality. And then, taking us to Carlton's expertise, this is often seen in the law. I mean, one of the more funny things that Carlton wrote about was the obscenity laws and the things that you're not allowed to say. They're all kind of disgust related.
Carlton, yeah.
No, I was just going to piggyback off that, but if you had a good pivot there, be my guest.
No, piggyback, and then I have a follow-up question for you.
Yes, all I was going to say is what Deb has done is, there's the way we get in here is that there is a kind of a two-step process that happens. Disgust feeds into morality, right? So there is there's a sort of shortcut there that happens with the way we think, to where disgust gets this moral weight attached to it, right? We tend to, like Deb said, pick other groups or behaviors or something and say, not only does this gross me out, but it's wrong. And then once that's there, well, now you can mobilize that, right? Because if you want to make a moral argument against a person, against the group, against behavior, trigger disgust. And maybe the thing's actually disgusting, right? Maybe you say this group, they cause diseases or they have diseases or whatever, but maybe not, right? Wartime genocidal propaganda, it's all filled with this imagery of cockroaches and snakes and slugs, and clearly isn't true. It's a metaphor, but nonetheless, the things people pick induce disgust.
Yeah. So like, say I'm watching a video that just went viral. That's an interesting word for internet thing too. But of a woman like going to a Dollar Tree and hoarding like 90 boxes of toilet paper and filling up 2 truckloads of toilet paper. I might say, like, this woman makes me sick, even though I'm nowhere near her. She's not actual like contagion threat, but this is a metaphor that I'm now using. And what how much of this is then like a feedback loop of you go like, oh, I don't agree with that thing of like hoarding or stealing or something like that doesn't doesn't make you nauseous, but then your stomach does kind of get a little bit upset too.
No, that could happen for sure. But really what you're doing is, listen, in South Florida, the drivers are just insane. And so the idea is like, you see someone do something, I don't know, cut across 5 lanes and you're like, that's just disgusting. Or you see, like you said, the hoarders, it's disgusting behavior. It makes me sick,
Yeah.
But what you're really doing, ancestrally, when you had these thoughts or you said these things, they were actually in public, right? So the idea that you say things and they're private and no one can hear you is a really weird situation for a hunter-gatherer. But what you're really doing is saying, that's disgusting, that's gross. And imagine if you then had 5 people around you be like, yeah, that's gross, let's get her, right? And so the idea that, disgust coordinates, and it's, you'd share that look of, we should say something, we should stop this. But it's really a fishing line. You're taking other people's temperature about, do you find this of low social value? And if you do, then we can coordinate together to target this person and condemn them, exploit them, prevent them from imposing any of these costs, taking our stuff, taking our toilet paper, and so forth. And so, so disgust can be quite dangerous in that sense. And it'd be very different if you said, that's disgusting, and the person next to you was like, that's my mom. And so that would be a very different kind of environment to be in. But disgust is dangerous, especially in these times.
Right. So Carlton, how much of this, you made the important point earlier that I find we often have to make with evolutionary psychology, where you have to, people that aren't familiar with it are like, are you saying that this is supposed to be this way, or this is us justifying actions? And it's more just about how things have been in the past, not necessarily the way they should be. And a lot of this is trying to understand where where some of these actions and preferences and judgments come from, so that we can, the more mindful of this we are, the better that we can make decisions. And much in the way that there's, I remember I started comedy in Boston, and Boston I think still has some law in the books that like you have to have like a musket when going through Boston Common or something like that legally, because there was like still bears and stuff around back when they like made that law. And just like before people understood germs, doctors would go like right from surgery into like delivering a baby, and they'd be covered in all sorts of blood and guts, and it was like this sign of pride, like, look how hard I'm working around here. And as we're these terrific humans, have this this intelligence stuff we're very proud of. We're these great tool makers, and the scientific method is in my opinion one of the single greatest tools that that humans have ever developed. Do you think that as we start being able to be like, look, the reason why we have this law against, say, homosexuality or something like that is because of these, like, this very outdated software that is really no longer applicable to our modern lives. Do you think that as that understanding, which this is still very, very new and mostly unknown to almost everybody, but do you think if you know, in your ideal world, everyone on earth reads the book Objection, do you think that would give people the opportunity to kind of reassess some of these laws and create a moral and legal landscape that is a little more up to date with our modern conditions and more free from our more unnecessary evolved instincts?
Why, yes, Shane. I think they would, and they can start by picking out a copy on Amazon today or their local bookseller. No, well,
which, by the way, people are still going to bookstores right now, which I'm like, just like thumbing through the pages and putting it back on the shelf. like you know, you can get audiobooks and books online and stuff, but anyway.
Well, that's the hope. That's why we wrote the book. It's not quite that easy though. So let's say in a perfect world, everybody read the book. Our most prominent legal scholars and legislators and judges read the book.
It's
and
the
now
new Bible.
Precisely, exactly. and they said, okay, well, I do have a better understanding of this stuff. Let's rethink it. Well, we haven't made an argument in the book that framework should then be replaced with something. So, for example, you know, if you look at obscenity law, what words, you know, you can or you can't say, and these have long been backed by the idea that we can. There's this underlying assumption that if something is morally bad, if it's wrong, if it offends us, that it's okay to prohibit. And then when we sort of look backwards, well, it turns out that in this instance, the things that run afoul of morality are actually words that refer to things that disgust us, right? It's not necessarily, there are worse things, if you ask me, out there, like racial slurs, you know, that do more actual psychological harm, but these are the ones that have been in there. And you know, when I look at something like that, I think we need a more coherent framework, right? Perhaps how much harm are we doing? I mean, there are lots of options out there. But all we said is, let's take a closer look. We want to highlight, here are the things that we've prohibited because they run afoul of our biology. They pose some sort of evolutionary threat, and they've just kind of been shepherded in, even though maybe they've sort of outlived their usefulness. We're now in a position where we can be philosophers instead of just relying on our biology about what's right and wrong. So we wanted to lay that bare so we can take a closer look, but we haven't necessarily said, okay, but now here's what you replace it with. Here are the words you can't say. Here are the sexual relationships that are okay and aren't okay. And that's a question. Next, it's a big question. You know, it's something that I think moral philosophers, you know, society as a whole, depends on how we want to make our decisions, but we have to make that next step. But I think for us, it wasn't good enough that we just fell back on this idea of well, this grosses me out.
So where were we?
All right, perfect. So I had just gotten done saying that, yes, the world would be a better place if everyone bought and read our book.
Of course.
And that I do think, so what I do think it will do is it sort of gives an explanation for why a lot of the things that disgust us end up being prohibited by law, so that we can go back and look. It doesn't necessarily give, not even necessarily, it doesn't give a replacement model. So for, okay, when we're talking about bad words, or when we're talking about sexual relationships, get rid of these things, you know, now here are the things we should allow and shouldn't. It doesn't give that, but what it does do is it gives an explanation, so that, you know, the real thinkers out there can get together and say, okay, well, given that, what now? So there's this other thing, there's this other complication, which is that change in the law happens slowly. A lot of the time, the famous jurist Benjamin Cardozo has this quote that justice is not to be taken by storm, she is to be wooed by slow advances. And the idea is that even if maybe our laws aren't on the firmest you know, framework, people base their decisions and their lives around those. They make, you know, they have sort of notice of what they can be punished for and can't be punished for. And so even when you say, okay, we've changed our mind, well, you tend to change those things incrementally and slowly, so that people can adjust their affairs accordingly. I mean, that's not always, but that's a sort of general idea. So even if we were to totally dispatch with this idea that disgust is enough, you know, we still have to replace it with something else in a coherent fashion, I would hope. And then you'd have to implement that change in a way that was responsible, so that you weren't just sort of overhauling things without notice.
Scientists always so very careful to not be prescriptive in any way. Very responsible science. All right, so I have a question for both of you, whoever wants to take this. When kind of we talk about the roots of something like disgust, and then how it's expressed now, and modern world, and how it eventually turns into all of these metaphors. Are there, what does that have anything to say about how we view other things differently, rather than like, I mean, I think it's easy to understand that you can then be like, hey, there's a Chinese virus, and this is a way of attacking an outgroup or the different people. You know, we've seen that old trick through all of humanity. But what about ideas themselves being judged as something that is in-group or out-group, and things like political beliefs, and saying like, well, if you're on this side of this fence or this side of that fence, you're a bad or a good or morally virtuous person?
I think disgust can be leveraged anywhere, anyhow. People, acts, ideas, and so you find that happening all over the place. So you can, you know, Republicans can think Democrats are disgusting, and, you know, liberals can think conservatives are disgusting. And I think that disgust is really a way to mobilize one's troop to attack the other troop. So it's just really a way of, you know, saying, who's with me? How strong are we? You know, do we have the force in order to go after them, and so forth? And, you know, do people agree with what I'm saying? And so.
Yeah, Paul Bloom has this wonderful quote in a New Yorker article he wrote. It's something, I'm going to paraphrase, but it's something along the lines of, you know, white supremacists use disgust when they talk about all these other groups, and then the rest of us use disgust when we talk about white supremacists. Right.
So I'm curious, as we start wrapping up. I'd love to hear about, and I don't have any time constraint. I have all of the spotty internet time in the world, but I don't want to keep you guys too long. How do you, people like yourselves, or what I'm trying to say is, how does your point of view, and as having spent so much time thinking and talking and writing about this subject, how does that influence your perception of things that are going on now? Do you have kind of some unique takes based on your background that that are influencing how you're interpreting this pandemic?
You want to go ahead, Deb?
Sure. So as someone interested in disgust and morality, obviously I've noticed the uptick in hygiene behaviors, but also how people view other people. There was a video that I was forwarded, maybe you guys saw it, I don't know, where it was on Facebook or something, where people are at a bus stop and a woman sneezes, and then like people pull out their aerosol spray cans and, you know, like, shh, and then one man pulls out his gun and kills her.
Whoa.
And just go back to kind of business as usual, waiting for the bus. And so it's obviously acted out. And so what the point is that, and I thought, so everyone's laughing at that, but to me, that is exactly what I am so nervous about. That thin veil of life is good, we're all protected by laws and things like this. But as soon as disgust gets hold, you know, so you had in that video exactly what I'm nervous about. The cleaning behaviors don't concern me. It is the, you know, the fact that people found it funny that then they were shocked. You know, it was funny, but it's not funny at the same time, because it means that, you know, getting rid of people who disgust us, and, you know, extermination, killing, and, you know, exploitation and jail and fining and all these things are things that are just so, you know, disgust and morality go hand in hand. And so, you know, it wasn't that, you know, everyone laughed at that guy who saw that video, likely, you know, and so no one condemns the guy who does that. And so the idea that now you have this kind of sanctioned killing of things that are disgusting, I know it was a video, but I'm just making the point that we naturally find these things funny. And that's what concerns me, because right now, where everyone's disgust is at an all-time high globally, I'm very nervous about any idiot that puts on that fire some type of moral meme about another group, about how it's due to another group, or there's another group associated with disgust. Yeah, that horrifies me. You know, I think that the lessons from the Holocaust and, you know, what's going on today, you have Rohingya Muslims and homosexuals are still being, you know, strung up. And so the idea that we would go after other people because of the disgust associated with this virus, it concerns me. So it also concerns me, obviously, the hoarding of food, but I think that will hopefully lessen. And I'd prefer that than the moral outrage. And so, it concerns me. I am concerned. I am less concerned when I stay home and I just work, because then I don't have to worry about the outside world. But things, disgust that keeps us clear of disease, and personal decisions to keep ourselves healthy, and to guide decisions, you know, about what to eat and what to touch and whether to have sex right now, I think is all very, very sane and healthy and rational. And disgust is rational in those ways. But as soon as it starts to go to, you know, who we should therefore target and condemn, we have to be very careful of that slippery slope, because it's there and it's dangerous.
Yeah, I think Deb is probably better at seeing through the matrix than I am. You know, sometimes I do the same thing where I watch other people's behavior, and I see the lines of code, right? That's sort of why I sought out evolutionary psychology, because I was like, oh, here's sort of where the answers are. This can tell us a lot of things. And sometimes when you see this, you can see exactly what's going on. And then there are other times, though, when I'm just in it and I don't have, I catch myself doing the same thing. I live in a neighborhood with a lot of families. We walk around. There's like a sort of open area that's like a grassy area on a lake that you can walk around, but there's a gate to get in and out. And when I see people like touching the gate, my first instinct is to be like, oh, how dare you? You're a terrible person for doing it. You're ruining it for everybody else. And so this is, exactly the type of thing that I understand why it happens and why my instinct would be that way and how dangerous it is. And yet human nature is just so strong that I see it, and that's my first reaction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. This is a bit of a cartoonish exaggeration for comic relief, but it was. I noticed it more than I ever would have. Where I had a very nerve-wracking yet pleasant 4-day drive to get from LA to Wisconsin, because it was like it was a lot more beautiful than they portrayed the apocalypse being in the movies and stuff. So the roads were clear, the weather was nice and everything, and I hated that I had to. I was worried gas stations were gonna shut down. I didn't know what, and then I'm sanitizing everywhere and having to touch gas pumps and stuff like that. And I remember going into a convenience store and the cashier like hiccuped, and I was like, oh, like just for a second, I was like, okay, I don't think it passes through hiccups. Like I think I'm okay. But it's funny because I'm not a I don't I'm usually a pretty fearless, even keel individual, and so if something like that's setting me off, I think a lot of people are really going to be on edge. And once people are on edge, man, it makes me nervous. So do you I guess in closing, usually on my podcast, I have my guests plug a nonprofit each week, but for these special episodes, and you're welcome to do that as well, but for these special episodes, I just think that this is an opportunity for people to take stock in their what they know and what is worth knowing. And I think that this is an opportunity where people are, for the first time in my life, being like, hey, maybe science has has some value in our world and can maybe help our lives. And I think that it can do a whole lot more than help us in a pandemic. There's a million other issues, and so, but I mean, it's a good start that all of a sudden people are like, well, can scientists fix this problem? And so now that I think that people are maybe just starting to wake up to that this is important, and then hopefully once they start learning a little bit about science, they'll be like, oh wow, and this is really, really interesting and fascinating. And I hope that people have the privilege of having science change their life and perception in the way that it has mine. I can be a little evangelical sometimes, but if people do want to be better engaged in the sciences, do you have any advice for where people how people could get started, and how people, like what people could do to increase public engagement and kind of spread the right kinds of information?
I have a simple one and an accessible one, which is just to click on the science pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post and the other sort of major outlets that do good science writing. I mean, a lot of times I think they're very good at picking up on my 3-year-old Jelly in the background. I think they're very good about picking up on the big studies that come out on major journals and making them accessible. And that's, to me, that's always a good entry point, because you do that, and then if you're feeling hardcore and you want to brew a pot of coffee and you want to go pick out the actual journal article and have a go at that, it's there for you. But it gives you a nice way, and I think by and large, those newspapers do a great job of stuff accessible.
Yeah,
Awesome.
no, I agree. I mean, I think there's some great general science writers out there. Bye, Shane. Like, you've got folks introducing like psychology and human nature. Steve Pinker is fantastic, and Matt Ridley has written a fantastic series of books. But with respect to infectious disease, Paul Ewald has written some great books on the evolution of infectious disease that might be, relevant right now, and he's fantastic.
Great. Well, thank you guys for joining me in such bizarre circumstances. I think my little silver lining about all this is I think that conversations like this and work like yours is going to only become more and more relevant in the public, and there's going to be more of a demand for it, and so I really appreciate you both giving me your time, and I encourage everyone to look at this. You're not going to be lucky enough to have had Debra sign it, but I'll make sure next time I'm in Miami, I'll have you sign this for me, Carlton. But make sure and check out their book, Objection. Thank you, Deb and Carlton, for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much. Good to see you.
And I'll hope to see you guys again next time I'm in Miami, when we can all travel and do things like that again.
Look forward to it.
All
right.
Care.
Thanks,
awesome,
Shane.
guys. Thank you so much. Bye.